The first Final Fantasy game I ever played wasn't the original on the NES, but what was known then as Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo. Eventually, I was able to find a copy of Final Fantasy for the NES, and I remember finding it for like $9 at KB Toys in the mall. The box didn't show anything about Cecil and Friends, and while I was a little disappointed, I was still intrigued and I went ahead and bought it. Or someone bought it for me. I was too young to be driving and likely didn't have a lot of money of my own at the time. As a kid, I remember Final Fantasy being very slow-paced. It was grindy and it was kind of boring. But for $9 in that package, I got a full map, a bestiary, a whole list of all the items, weapons, armor, and magic spells, and it was really cool. But unfortunately, the only thing I have left is this. This is all I've got left of all of that cool insert stuff. Such is life. I only ever made it as far as like Elfland, and as many people know, that point in the game is where you have to grind out a bunch of levels before heading into the Marsh Cave. I made a few attempts at the dungeon, only to die horrible deaths by the myriad dangers within. I never made it any further until I was much older. When the remake came out on the PlayStation, Final Fantasy Origins, I finally finished it. I finally finished Final Fantasy. And then I beat it again when it came out on the GBA. And then I beat it again when it came out on PSP. And as I grew more and more entrenched into the YouTube and Twitter scene online, my hunger to go ahead and finally beat Final Fantasy on the NES grew. My buddy the Bug Doctor pointed out that you could increase the text speed on the title screen, and that would make gameplay much more tolerable. The game defaults to a super slow text speed that makes battles drag on. Bumping it up to 8 makes fights go by so much faster. Somehow over all these years, I had missed that. So I bumped it up to 8 and let her have it. I ripped through the game and had a blast. Final Fantasy lets you create a team of 4 adventurers and lead them through a quest to restore power to the elemental orbs that they carry. Of course, Final Fantasy fans will recognize the orbs as the famous elemental crystals for which the series is known. Throughout your adventure, you meet a lot of pretty generic NPCs, such as kings, elves, dwarves, scholars, and mermaids. And you fight all kinds of very familiar fantasy monsters, but also a bunch of interesting and new enemies. As an early release in the pantheon of Japanese console role-playing games, Final Fantasy really just had a lot of really cool stuff. This was all groundbreaking. I mean, obviously, Enix had done a little bit of their own before with the Dragon Quest series, but Final Fantasy was original enough in its artwork and its theming that it had its own identity. You encounter battles randomly as you adventure around the world, except for some predetermined locations where monsters will guard treasure chests, and others where you will encounter a boss. The battle system, when compared to later Final Fantasy games, seems pretty primitive, but after playing through the original game a few times this year, I've really grown to enjoy it. If you kill a monster with one character, and have a second character also targeting the newly dead monster, you'll see an ineffective message. Also, your spellcasters have spell slots rather than magic points, meaning you have to conserve your spells and use them wisely, rather than just using them all willy-nilly. But this adds to the level of strategy involved in planning out battles, an element of the game I really enjoy. Eventually, you'll obtain magical items that you can use to cast essential spells in battle so you don't have to waste spell points. This helps make dungeon treks a lot easier, especially when you have an item that can target every enemy for a level 2 elemental attack, or heal every ally without penalty. The good thing is, by the time you gain these items, their effects aren't so overpowered that it trivializes combat. You can still very much get your ass handed to you. These items just make some of the grind of random encounters just a bit easier. There are also a lot of enemies that inflict status effects onto your characters. If you run into a group of monsters that have paralyzing effects, try to take them out quickly, or you'll just sit there and watch them beat on your helpless adventurers. And poison. God, I hate poison. Not because it hurts my characters, but because any character afflicted with poison after a battle is sent to the bottom of the party lineup. You have to go into a completely separate menu to fix this party lineup too. thank Sakaguchi this doesn't carry over into later titles. Also, early on, you have no way to bring a character back from being knocked out. You have to wander all the way back to a town, to a clinic, to bring him back to his senses. And when you do learn a life spell to raise characters, you can't do it in battle. If your main fighter is knocked out in the final battle of the game, he's done. Completely done. Forever. For fuck's sake, Tony. The dungeons in the game are all pretty big and easy to get lost in if you don't have a map. Luckily, the game came with all of those maps bundled in. Of course, I don't have those anymore, so I used maps online, and I used maps up through the entire game because I don't like getting lost in dungeons in old grindy RPGs. Overall, the dungeons are enjoyable. They're very much dated in their design, with spots where you have to walk and take damage to get through them, and tons of dead ends and treasure chests that bait you into going out of your way to open them, only to contain a paltry amount of gold or a bit of armor that you outclassed hours ago. But the theming of the dungeons is fun and charming, delving into a volcano and fighting fiery monsters, or climbing a tower filled with ancient technology is really cool stuff, especially for the time. There really isn't much of a story to speak of. The four adventurers, each carrying a darkened orb, arrive in Corneria, apparently looking for work. They save the king's daughter, Princess Sarah, who is kidnapped by the former knight Garland. After that, the king has a bridge built to connect to the rest of the world, and the party ventures forth in search of the reason the four elements are out of control, and to restore their orbs in the process. They defeat the Lich, who is rotting away the earth, Carrie, who had taken control of the world's fire and was planning on using the volcano of Mount Gulg to scorch the earth, Kraken, who had stagnated the world's seas, and Tiamat, who had halted the wind. After this, they uncover the time loop that Garland and the four fiends had enacted that spanned 2,000 years, making the destruction of the earth happen over and over. The adventurers kill Garland, who turned himself into chaos, and restore the land of peace. It makes about as much sense as a football bat. I can't put my finger exactly on why I like this game so much. One major reason could be character progression. Learning new spells, getting new weapons and armor, leveling up, just becoming more powerful, even proving to Bahamut, King of the Dragons, that you deserve a class change. Another reason could be the strategic element to battling. Unlike later games in the series, you can't just spam the A button to victory. You actually have to plan stuff out, and that makes combat pretty engaging. It could also be seeing the roots of the Final Fantasy series all in one place. Witnessing some of the recurring monster designs in the original forms is really cool, as well as seeing the origin of legendary items such as the Massamune and the Ribbon. Final Fantasy is a really cool experience, and even though it has aged, I still have fun coming back to this one on its original hardware. So, should you check out Final Fantasy on the NES? Of course, especially if you want to see the series' roots. If you aren't afraid of clunky old 8-bit RPGs, it's definitely a cool experience. It's definitely something I would recommend playing. But if you are kind of sensitive to that clunky old RPG design, you may want to try out the remakes on the PlayStation, the GBA, or the PSP. Though I do have my thoughts on those, but we might cover that in a future video. Thanks for watching, guys. Later.